Welcome everyone who is here. I know there are some people that are going to be coming in late and some people that are going to be leaving, but we actually wanted this day to be quite intimate, small, intimate. We had a long waiting list, which makes us happy to know that we had a long waiting list, and we had to tell some people no. And there are some people actually sitting here that know that they came in at the last moment when we were able to free up some space. So we welcome everyone that was here. But what we wanted is to have something small so that we can bring up dilemmas, so that we can discuss research, so that we can speak about things. Very, very briefly, I wanted to speak a bit about our center, but I think most of you know the center. I have something written out, but I would probably want to say, sorry, there's nothing on here right now.
No, but it's on your face.
Okay. Probably the most important thing I want to say about the center is that it's very interdisciplinary, and our most important interdisciplinary member of the center is Ariel Tenenbaum, our physician that sits at the Down Syndrome Clinic. Because as I was having breakfast here this morning and we slept over here, I spilled boiling tea on my leg. And he was able to 1 minute drive into Hadassah Hospital, and Ariel came in and said, she must open an international conference, please treat her fast. And they did, and I even got a special tetanus shot, and I'm here to clinic. So yeah, interdisciplinary, very, very, very important, and trying to make that a very central thing in our center. So the Center of Disability Studies, most of you are familiar with it. We opened it just this past October, and it's a joint venture between our School of Social Work and Israel Unlimited. Israel Unlimited by itself is also joined to JDC, Ruderman Family Foundation, and the Israeli government. So we have quite a few forces that we work with. The aim of our center is to try to look at disability not through the lens of the medical model and not through the lens of views impairment, but through the lens of the social model and the social perspective. So trying to see all those things that actually cause disability, being environmental forces, being attitudes, being political forces, being all those things that actually produce disability. And we try to look through this, and I'm not going to say much about that because Roni, who is sitting right beside me, and the other very, very important thing to say about Roni is that he's my main partner in crime, so anything that happens here, he's actually the one responsible for it.
Besides the tea.
He was also there when the tea happened. He didn't warn me. So Roni is the main partner in crime, and maybe it's possibly the best time to also sort of say thank you for all of this. We have a lot more. So what we really plan to have today is we have wonderful experts. We had really good talks from them yesterday. And the talks yesterday were bigger, and this is our opportunity now to have all our experts in a more intimate fashion that we can ask questions, we can deal with research, and this is the aim. We don't want to take a lot of time for the opening, but we will have a roundabout, mainly for our colleagues from abroad to know who is here. So, not your name and your favorite pet and all of that, but just your name, where you work, period. And I'm going to say that we have made a lot of time in between sessions so that we will have time to chat and mingle around, so you will know everyone. So maybe just briefly so we know who is who. Judah.
Okay. I'm Judah Kohler. I'm on faculty here in the School of Education, just on the other side of this building, where I chair the graduate division in special ed, and I help run the university's New Autism Center. I have the honor of being on the academic committee for the disability studies.
My name is Limon Levinsky, and I work in Shalva.
And Limon and Judah, both of them, along with two other people, are my partners. Limon is a PhD student in Judah in the study I told you about yesterday. I'm a donor of the special education and inclusive study.
And I'm Eli Peretz from the research unit of Beit Shapiro. Can I ask people to talk louder?
So shy.
Heli Peretz. Heli Peretz is from Beit Izi Shapiro, which is one main service providing agency that is kindergartens for special needs, and Heli sits in the research department. We'll start the inside round from Tamar.
I'm a translator and I work most of the time with hard of hearing people. Translator.
She is our home transcriber. It's full position.
I'm about to start my PhD in communication, new media, and disability studies.
Brian Avery from the University of Minnesota's Institute on Community Integration and Global Resource Center on Inclusive Education.
Renata Tika, the same place.
Michal Gleitman, I'm a philosopher. I do philosophy of language here at the Van Leeuwen Institute.
I'm Dory Rivkin. I run the unit for research and disability at the Brookdale Institute, which is an applied research institute. And I'm also doing a PhD at Haifa University with Arik Rimmerman on the topic of guardianship.
Hi, my name is Danielle. I'm a student here at the NGO Management program.
לי קוראים אלי ריבלין, ויש לי מרכז מידע לאנשים עם מוגבלות על מקומות נגישים.
He runs a research Eli runs a research information center for people with disabilities where they can get information on services and things like that.
Good morning. My name is Noga Buber Ben David. I'm a PhD student from here, from BU, in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology.
I'm Carolyn Goodman from a college up North Tel High, which is up very, very high in Israel. I'm teaching in the social work and in the education departments, disability studies.
היי, שמי דגנית מאייר. אני מלמדת בתיכון ילדים עם צרכים מיוחדים. אני כרגע גם מחפשת אפיק להרחיב לדוקטורט שלי. התחום מחקר שאני עוסקת בו זה הורים לילדים עם צרכים מיוחדים. והדגש הוא על ההורים ולא על הילדים. שאני ככה in between חינוך וסוציולוגיה.
She's a special education teacher in a high school for kids with special needs and wanting to start her PhD studies on the topic of kids and parents, and mainly on the parents.
אני עדי, אני גם מורה בחינוך מיוחד בבית ספר תיכון.
You see, that's way too quiet.
My name is Adi.
I'm also a teacher in a special education setting. Okay. If English is good, it's good.
Yeah, I can do it. My name is Michal Colton. I just applied to do my master's degree in social psychology, and I work at Anosh, which is a non-profit organization that helps people with mental illness. So mainly I help them in the occupation aspect of their lives.
היי, עברית. אני יפעת שוורץ, אני דוקטורנטית בתחום של לימודי מוגבלות בפילוסופיה באוניברסיטת בר אילן.
PhD at Bar Ilan University.
My name is Remo Gadot, and I'm teaching at the social work at Sophia's College, and I'm also a PhD student at social work department in Ben-Gurion University.
I'm Noah Talon. I'm a PhD student at Bar Ilan University in the education department.
Hello, I'm Carmit Noah Spiegelman, lecturer and researcher at the Department of Community Mental Health at the University of Haifa.
You're here, Kermit, today.
I'm Flat. I'm a PhD student here at the social work, and I'm a coordinator of a study group for PhD students.
Ira Stern. I'm a PhD student here at the School of Social Work. Shiva is a PhD student. And I also work as a social worker at the Nitzan organization, which is an organization that works with people with learning disabilities.
I'm Tim Staten. I'm from the School of Social Work at the University of British Columbia, and I direct the center called Center for Inclusion and Citizenship at UBC.
Hi, I'm Celestia Zitverdi. I'm a supervisor of people with diagnostic system of people with intellectual disabilities. I'm also finished now my thesis on Bar-Ilan University about the journey of people with intellectual disability to Poland.
Maybe for the guest explain why they go to Poland.
I have to do it in Hebrew. It's a very long explanation. So one later.
Many students in Israel go to Poland in order to learn about the Holocaust and the history of Jewish people in Europe.
And
visit people with intellectual disabilities who have many times been quite the first victims there to bring these people with intellectual disabilities to meet and visit.
ואנחנו עושים שעד עכשיו הם בעצם עד השנים האחרונות הם היו מודרים מהשיח החברתי על השואה, ובעצם אנחנו כן מאמינים בשוויון זכויות גם בנושא.
This also fits in very well with the whole issue of inclusion, because people with intellectual disabilities have also quite frequently been excluded even from the conversation about the Holocaust and what happened there. So having them learn about it, hear about it, and take part in this. Next year, in one of our research meetings, we'll be called upon, don't worry.
My name is Till Leibinger from the University of Lüneburg in Germany. I'm working with Shelley and Ira on a joint project where we compare children with intellectual disabilities in Germany and Israel. Yeah, we're almost finished with our project, and I'm happy to be here.
My name is Idit Shemla. I'm a student and occupation therapist at Hadassah Hospital, and I'm learning here. And the youngest student is Lotan.
PhD student?
Of course, just PhD. I will tell you.
So, Millie, you came just in time to be the last ones to introduce yourself.
There is another one.
Introduce yourselves.
Millie Breuer. I'm a student, disability study candidate in UIC, and doing work on stigma and performance. And I will talk later.
Mital Bar-Lev, researcher at the Brookdale Institute.
Wonderful. So thank you all for coming, and Ronnie is going to have about 12-14 minutes to introduce us.
14 minutes?
14. And from now on after that, Kristen time guy.
So I'm going to speak very, very fast. So we can now. My turn? Okay, so first of all, I'm Ronnie Oliver, and I'm from the School of Social Work here at the University of Jerusalem. Is it loud enough here? Okay. And I'm also a member, a proud member of the Center for Disability Studies in our school, and part of, how did you say it?
Partner in crime.
Partner in crime. So first of all, it's a great pleasure seeing so many of you here with us today. And I think also that so many of you being here with us today indicates the growing interest in disability studies in Israel, and this is something which we should celebrate and sing and be very happy about. And I hope that the workshop today will be part of this process. That's it, yes. So my main task today, and also my slides, is a very modest one. Since all of us come from different professional, ideological, theoretical reference, my main task is just to put us on the same page, and I'll do that by briefly and very briefly, 14 minutes, explaining what is the social model of disability and in which ways it is different from the traditional individual, medical, everybody has different names, model of disability. Okay, as some of you probably know, there isn't one social model of disability or one individual model of disability, but each one of the two is comprised of a different set of theories, approaches, and premises. Again, we have only 14 minutes, so my main task is just to give you the essence of each model, so I will have to overlook the differences that are still very much exist in each model. Let's start. As you all know, people with physical, sensory, intellectual, and mental impairments have historically faced major obstacles in their efforts to realize their social, political, and civil rights, and Tim talked about it yesterday. Among others, they tend to have low rates of participation in the labor market, have limited educational opportunities, participate less in political decision-making platforms, be under the legal mechanism of guardianship, be at greater risk of poverty, and struggle in general harder to make their ends meet. We can say, and I think we can all agree about it, that in general people with impairments are in many ways disabled. The question is, what is the reason behind these disabled conditions, and even more importantly, what are the solutions to their social exclusions? And throughout the years, if you look in historical perspective, the individual model of disability has been the hegemonic, theoretical, and ideological framework for answering these questions. Again, I'm going to talk about the individual social model. Most of you probably know, just to put that on the same page, so it will be very simple and only the essence of each model. Anyway, according to the individual model of disability, disability is considered to be a personal issue, resulting largely from the person's impairment or from his or her inability to overcome its negative consequences. Since, as I said, many of us come from helping professions such as psychology, social work, physical therapy, it is also very important to note that it's not just, although usually being framed in medical terminology, this is not only about medical interventions. Usually the individual model of disability refers also to dysfunctional and psychological aspects of impairments. Just to give you a few examples, we are talking about the person's motivation, his resilience, locus of control, self-efficacy, self-esteem, hope, emotional adaptations, and much, much more concepts, psychological concepts that we use on a daily basis when we work with people with disabilities. In general, we can say that having an impairment according to the individual model of disability, and especially being unable to adapt to it, psychologically adapt to it, is the main cause for the marginalization of people with impairments in society. I think Rutan agrees with me. Anyway.
Everybody's critic.
As I say, of course, locating the problems in the individual's body, mind, and attitudes also leads us to similar solutions. One is focused on medical prevention, classification, cure, compensation, and rehabilitation. And also here, the individual model refers not only to medical interventions, as I said, but also to variant therapeutic interventions, including, just a few examples, practicing individual stigma management, teaching adaptive coping skills, capacity building, and much more. This is the slide, by the way. And lastly, from this individual perspective, disability is considered to be a professional rather than a political category. And this depoliticization means two things. First, it assigns almost exclusive power and authority to the professionals over the lives of their clients. And secondly, and this is very important, it rejects the collective aspect of disability, and in this regard, disabled people are seen as separate individuals without meaningful political and social relationship with each other. We will talk later about the social model of disability, and you can see how the social model views disability as a political category and with meaningful political and social relationship with each other. Anyway, adopting the individual model of disability with its medical, rehabilitative, and psychological interventions has surely brought many benefits to people with impairments. Just to give you a few examples, it raised their longevity, improved their physical functionality, and in some cases also enhanced their coping strategies. However, as Lotan expressed it, in recent years, many people with and without disabilities, activists and scholars, have rightly pointed to the negative consequences that accompany this individual model of disability, and especially its tendency to view disability as a pathological and tragic condition. And this is the social model of disability, which tried to turn the disability phenomenon on its head and views it as a category embodied in history, society, and culture. While not denying the value of medical therapeutic and rehabilitative interventions, it argues that they are insufficient to achieve meaningful inclusion in a society dominantly constructed for the needs and desires of the normal, let's say, able-bodied persons, nor are they sufficient to capture fully the lived experiences of people with disabilities. In other words, according to the social model of disability, the marginalization of people with impairments has not been only a result of individual medical, functional, or even psychological deficit located in the people's body or mind, but mainly a result of social barriers created historically by disabling attitudes and structures. Again, this is a very simplistic way of explaining it, but we have only 6 minutes. And of course, not surprisingly, according to the social interpretation of disability, society is also where the solution lies, and the aim is to structurally change the environment in order to change the status quo and achieve meaningful social change. Among others, it advocates for anti-discrimination legislation, physically accessible environments, personal support schemes, and Tim talked about it yesterday, user-led services, and of course tackling stigma and problematic attitudes towards people with impairments. And lastly, and I think very importantly, in contrast to the individual interpretation of disability, the social one views disability as a political category embodied and constructed within a system of power relations. On the practical level, it calls for a greater individual and collective control of disabled people over their own lives and in designing and implementing social services, and also calls for collective actions of disabled people in political organizations and activities, and the latter also involves encouraging disabled people to positively identify as members of the disability community, and I think it will also come up later with some of the talks. Anyway, this Copernican revolution, which locates disability and society and views it as a political category, has of course huge implications for conducting disability research. In fact, one of the harshest critiques of the social model has been pointed towards the mainstream disability research and its main platform, which is academic research. This critique has fundamentally and for sure fundamentally challenged the way disability research is done. And by the way, even that field of study that we call disability studies, and we have the Center of Disability Studies, and it's not by accident, of course. Anyway, we are all here today because the social model-based research also raises many questions, unsolved questions, and many and confronts us with unique and important challenges. I will only point out some of these challenges and questions, and fortunately we have our speakers later to dig deeper into them. And so the first issue, I'm going to talk about the issues now. Just to say a few words about issues that I found important to social model-based research. There are many other issues that will come up today. And the first issue relates to the need to focus our scientific gaze not on the individual, of course, but on society. And this reorientation of the focus is not, of course, without problems. I can give you many examples, but one example just to let you know what I mean. What do you mean by social reality, for example? What is the social reality that we want to understand and to change? For example, is it the material reality that's at stake here? Is it the cultural representations that we are talking about? And of course, if you want to combine the material, for example, the economic situation, and the cultural representations, how can we do it? it's not an easy task, and of course it raises many methodological even questions regarding disability research. Another issue, and this is a very important issue of course, is the role of disabled people and service users in research. If disability is not strictly a professional issue, but rather a political issue, disability research should give disabled people and service users much more power in the research production. And this change in the social production of research, of course, is not an easy task and raises itself many important questions. Just to give you a few examples. What does involvement in research mean? Who has the power and authority to define the terms of involvement? Who should benefit from the material and symbolic rewards of this involvement? What kind of unique knowledge do disabled people bring to this involvement? Should users' involvement also require us to use specific methodological paradigms such as participatory or emancipatory research? And if so, what are the chances for conducting these kinds of research in an organizational environment, academic organizational environment, let's say, of publish or perish? Is it possible to do it? It's very, I think, a major issue. Identity is also a major issue. As I said, the social model of disability is basically about identity politics. It is about viewing disabled people either as a community, minority group, let's say, with shared experience of oppression, or as a cultural community with shared customs, values, meanings, and even sometimes languages. This identity politics is also not without its problems. Just to give you a few examples, this is from my own dissertation, my own thought about it. Is it possible or even justified to conduct research about disabled people without referring to a specific group of people with impairments? Is it possible, for example, to research the history of disability policy without distinguishing between policies towards people with mental impairments, for example, and policies towards people with physical impairments? These, of course, I think, are major issues. And another issue, and very much related, is the issue of the body, the role of the body and personal experience. If disability, of course, is located in society and not in the people's body, what role, if any, is left to the body and personal experience? In the past, social model-based research has overlooked the role of the body, and I think Nili is going to talk about it a bit. But current social model theories call for bringing back the body. This time, and this is very important, not from a medical diagnostic perspective, but rather from a social one, to look at the body from a social perspective. This reconnection of the private and the political is not an easy task, and the question how should it be done is for sure a major challenge for future social model-based research. And lastly, the last issue is reconnecting, it's not reconnecting, it's the structure and agency. This is another major issue which I think that social model scholars have historically tended. Anyway, I think this is an issue that social model scholars have tended to ignore, and this tendency is about the role of the human agency. And as probably some of you know, there is a bias in social model not towards medical determinism, but towards social determinism, which denies the individual experience and its ability to negotiate with and even resist the status quo. In this respect, one of the challenges of social model-based research is to examine not only how society and social policies structure the life choices of disabled people, but also to examine the choices and the strategies that disabled people themselves undertake within these social and even structural constraints. Of course, this requires us to use more nuanced understanding of the complex interrelationship between structure and agency and how they combine with each other. Yes, so these are some of the issues, not all of the issues. As I said, I could only touch on them in a nutshell, but fortunately we have speakers, we have a long day before us, so the speakers, I think, could at least delve a bit deeper into some of the issues, and I think also bring other issues which are relevant. And of course, you can ask questions afterwards, and you can raise your own questions if you find it important in conducting social model-based research.
So we have our first speaker, which is Dr. Tim Stainton, who will talk about the embodiment and identity model of disability and its implications for research. And I do hope that if anyone, I don't know how Tim, if I go by yesterday, but he will say for himself if you would like questions throughout or just at the end. But just to say, if someone does want to ask question and really prefers Hebrew as you did just now, we will of course translate.
Okay. Well, we had a bit of an awkward moment the other day. We discovered Ronnie was basically doing the same presentation as I was doing, and he was first. And of course, it raises some problems in that they very kindly spent a lot of money to bring me here, so I have to say something. So, I did some quick editing last night, but I think it builds very well. I think Ronnie did a great job laying out the models and introducing some of the issues that I want to cover, which set up. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through quickly just to augment a little bit on the medical and the social models, and then focus mainly on the embodiment and identity models. And we can debate the question of whether the identity and embodiment models are different models than the social model or an extension of the social model. But that would be a good question for debate and discussion.
I just want to say that we had a heck of a difficulty knowing how to translate embodiment into Hebrew.
I think if you want to translate to
so yeah, feel free to interrupt me or ask questions. I mean, to be honest, the embodiment and identity models get fairly complicated fairly quickly, theoretically. I'm not 100% sure I fully grasp it, so feel free to argue and contest and clarify anything I say. I think I'll just skip through some of these issues. And just a couple other points around, as Ronnie said, the medical model really is located within the person, deviation from the norm, ignores the impact of social arrangements, and really has a response which is about fixing that individual, a curative or ameliorative kind of intervention. So obviously that creates a certain dilemma for those who can't or don't want to be fixed, right? So the result is, so if a medical intervention, try to fix somebody, you can't fix it, where does that leave the person, right? And that's in large part what creates this sort of charitable or exclusionary response, right? All right, we tried, we can't fix them, but because we're nice people, we'll be nice to them. But we're also positioning as very much damaged goods, almost human, other than us, because we can't fix them. Just one other point, that really we talk in disability studies, we talk about the medical model as if somebody sat down and wrote the medical model. So it's really important to recognize that the medical model you won't find written down by anybody from the medical models. It's really, because it is the dominant or the hegemonic norm, it's invisible to society in the same way patriarchy, other kinds of oppressions are. So part of our role and part of the job of the social model is to make the invisible visible. Okay? So the social model really kind of came out of a couple of things. There was, the US had a trend that was slightly different called the minority group model. The social model, as we kind of define it now, was really, as Ronnie said, it was a political model. It wasn't an academic model originally. it was largely came out of a group called UPS, the Union of Persons with
Against segregation. Against segregation.
Yeah, and it was an organization in the UK of largely people with physical disabilities. Okay, and that's really important because some of the challenges of the social model revolve around how well it applies the further you move away from a physical disability perspective.
It was also mainly men. It was also mainly men
It was
that
mainly men.
dominated that group, and there is also the feminist perspective against.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. It was very Mike Oliver and some of those others who became associated with it. So it was a very male
And white.
developed model.
And white.
And white. So I think Ronnie's kind of covered that bit, so I'm going to skip over there. And this is somewhat redundant, but so the social model, the key changes are it's locating the problem in society, not within the person, and it focuses on interventions in society and changes. The simplest analogy for me for the social model is if someone uses a wheelchair to get around and they come up to a set of steps. The medical model says, oh, too bad you can't come in the building because you're in a wheelchair. The social model says you can't come in the building because there's no ramp. You build a ramp, you eliminate the disability. And in some ways, that's the beauty of the social model, is its simplicity and the obvious kind of fit with political action that engenders. The downside is that simplicity means that it's often excluded certain groups within the disability community and limited its scope. So a key point that Ronnie touched on, but I just want to re-emphasize, because this is critical, I think, to understanding the embodiment and identity models, is that a key sort of theoretical feature of the social model is to separate the concepts of impairment and disability. So impairment is that the paraplegia, the intellectual disability, the whatever, right? And the social model in its traditional form accepts that as kind of a pre-social essential fact. What it says is that essential fact or impairment need not disable someone in society with the right social arrangements. Okay, so then that key sort of theoretical tenet is really the site of contestation, if you like, with the embodiment and identity models. So, sorry, this is a little bit small. So the social model, has actually always had trouble including people with very complex disabilities, intellectual disabilities, where this simple dichotomy of impairment and disability doesn't always work. And in fact, in more later writings of the key social model, Ben, they acknowledge that. Well, it may not totally apply to some folks. And we see that in the political movement, that people with intellectual disabilities, people with very complex disabilities who often have more difficulty communicating, have not been prominent, nor have their issues been prominent within the mainstream disability rights movement. They tended to be excluded. And part of the argument is that is a natural consequence of the theoretical foundation that's been laid. It's sometimes also led to questionable positions, not necessarily questionable. I mean, from a strategic point of view, they often make sense. But I don't know about Israel, but in North America, the position around employment has been that everybody can work and everybody can be gainfully employed at regular wages. Now, if there's a strategic position, that's a useful point to take. The reality is, if you have someone who has a very, very severe intellectual disability, doesn't communicate, needs extensive support, they're unlikely ever to be employed in the traditional full wage, full employed kind of sense. So they kind of get left out of that picture, right? One of the debates in my own province has been, we have a system of disability supports which is quite generous in allowing people to work without losing their benefits up to about $800 a month, which is almost double what their disability pension is. Well, because of politics, the movement has never wanted to emphasize a strategy of saying, let's maximize people's $800 a month level, which would be a significant economic gain for a lot of folks with intellectual disabilities. But because of the politics and the positioning that says everybody can work at real jobs for real pay all the time, that kind of position hasn't been one that sat well with the movement. And again, I would say that's a direct consequence of the models that we've been using. So, starting really in the late 80s, early 90s, some feminist scholars started to question the traditional social model. So people like Jenny Morris and Susan Wendell and Rosemary Garland Thompson started to question what they saw as a diminution, too early to say that word.
To make smaller. To reduce.
I can't say it at all, right? It's a diminution. Reducing the importance of the body and that personal experience. Right? So they started to say that, you know, you can't just pretend that I don't experience pain in my body. That is not purely a social construct. That's not going to go away with social arrangements. But the way the model has been set up, it removes that from the debate, if you like, because it's not amenable to social repair. It gets forgotten. And it's really a logical extension of traditional feminist thinking of the personal is political. So feminists said that the social model actually diminishes what has been the core traditional political strategy of the feminist movement by removing the personal to a large extent, or the body particularly, from the equation. They also argued that it limits, bizarrely, the scope for a positive disabled identity. And this one's a little bit hard to get your head around. So I'm going to step back a little bit and let's look at the logic of the social model. Okay, so the social model logic is that impairment is pre-social, an essential feature of the person. Disability is social. It's a very straight ahead dichotomy. So if we're going to solve the problem of disability, we're going to deal with all of these social barriers and limitations which create the disablement. So follow the end point of that logic through, that if we can get to a perfect world, disability disappears. So it creates essentially a disappearance thesis of disability, right? Because you get rid of all those barriers, all the stigma, everything, you have no more disability. Impairment remains, but in the model, impairment is pre-social, right? So we have a limited ability to actually interrogate or look at that phenomenon. So an analogy would be if we said the way to solve racism is to make everyone in the world colorblind. It would solve the problem, right?
So who?
Yeah.
How do you do it?
And I think most people of color would say, yeah, but being black is part of who I am. In the same way women say, we can't have a justice system or a social arrangement which ignore gender. That the traditional liberal equality, which basically is, the analogy is a colorblind justice, is where we're going to get rid of any inequalities in a system based on race, gender, or whatever, is the nature of justice. And in the same way, feminists criticize that and say, no, my identity as a woman, or my identity as a black person, is something that needs to be part of and recognized within the justice system, rather than eliminate it through a traditional liberal equality. So traditionally we call that a substantive equality rather than a formal equality. I'm going to stop there because that's kind of a lot complicated, just to make sure everybody's still with me. Anybody? Suppose we have two options here. Absolutely nobody has a clue what I'm talking about, or we're all good. We're all
I
good?
think you can see what you're talking about most prominently in the deaf community.
Well, the deaf community is a very good analogy because, as most of you would know, the deaf community don't consider themselves part of the disability community. They're an independent, identity-based, largely linguistic, identity-based cultural group. So that's a good kind of analogy. So in some ways, we're trying to make space for that same kind of conceptualization within the disability model, which doesn't contradict necessarily the social model, but provides another avenue and a way to encompass the notions of identity in a positive way, while retaining necessary solidarity for political action. Okay? So really what the identity model is calling for is a recognition of the disabled self. Okay? So rather than say impairments is something over here that's different, it's essential quality, but none of that needs to translate into disabilities. People are saying we need to find a way to reincorporate the self and the body within the model, because it is important to who I am in the same way my gender, my race is important to who I am, part of my identity, if you like. So I mentioned this, that you know, the characterization of impairment as pre-social essential characteristic is actually can be an oppressive conceptualization. So feminist disability scholars argue that in fact the self is neither pre-social nor exclusively socially constructed. So they're not arguing that they don't feel this pain and that pain isn't real. They don't struggle with their physical mobility regardless of how many ramps and how accessible our world is. Okay? Thirdly, they argue that accommodation alone can't bring about substantive equality. Because just accommodation will only lead to this formal equality. Okay, a traditional liberal formal equality. So if we are trying to get to a place where disability is a legitimate identity which needs to be recognized as similar to race and gender, then we need to expand a traditional social model dichotomy at the risk of bringing back the, sorry, let me back up a little bit. So what they're saying is we don't want to go back to a medical model which characterizes me as diseased, as deficient, as other. But I want to have the space to recognize that I feel pain, that I struggle in my body, without that being politically incorrect. So in the end, it's kind of a move to try to position disability in a more direct equivalency to gender or race. So, some of the things that this might change, so it doesn't discount or eliminate the role of the social model as the primary model in a political action kind of approach. But it does open up space for exploration of more personal experiences of disability, a more intimate experience that's not simply related to externally imposed barriers. So, some issues around the nature of suffering, pain, sexuality, disability, arts and culture, all of that stuff has a lot more space to breathe in this model than in a traditional social model. A lot of this is coming to the fore in relation to, I've been doing a lot of work around disability and assisted suicide, which has been a big issue in Canada. And one of the issues we've really explored is the nature of suffering and the role of suffering in human identity and that kind of stuff. Because the traditional approach, one of the things that politically we've struggled with, traditional utilitarian logic in ethics says suffering is bad, therefore the elimination of suffering is good, therefore allowing disabled people to be assisted in suicide is a good thing because it ends their suffering. So to respond to that, we have two choices. We could say, well, they don't suffer, and that's partly true in a lot of ways. So there's some really neat literature around struggling versus suffering, which is more a social model approach. It says I struggle because I can't get the services I need, I can't get supports I need, blah, blah, blah. But that's only going to get you part of the way there. You also need a way that can interrogate the role of suffering in my identity and how that has been, how I can express that. And that's really why I think the arts piece comes in, because historically the arts have been a primary site for humans to express notions of suffering. So a lot of disability artists are playing with that. I think this hopefully is obvious at this point. It allows a lot more space to be inclusive of all disabilities regardless of the degree. So we can say we don't have to pretend anymore that everything can be ameliorated through accommodation. Right? And ultimately, it hopefully provides a base for a more positive and enduring basis for a group solidarity based on a substantive disability identity in the same way that the women's movement, the civil rights movement, and other movements have had. But the social model has somewhat inadvertently limited the scope of that. That goes back to what I was saying, the fantasy world, if we eliminate all the barriers, disability disappears. Not a really strong basis for an identity politics. Anybody still sort of with me? Okay. I'm kind of on the edge of my seat here too, so I have some. Hopefully we can have a robust debate. I think it provides a much stronger basis for exploring intersectionality. So there's been a lot of work and talk around how women's movement, the civil rights movement, disability rights movement can work together. And I think this kind of approach allows us a stronger basis for that, but also for exploring within oneself issues of intersectionality. So I'm not just a disabled person, I'm a disabled black woman. I'm a disabled Jewish woman. It allows us a more equal footing, if you like, for those competing synthesized identities within a self. Okay? I think it provides a more a robust basis for a positive assertion of a disabled identity. and I think provides a stronger basis for challenging social exclusion, stigma, and diminished personhood. Right? Because one of the problems, most of my work has been with people with fairly severe intellectual cognitive disabilities. They've never fit well within a social model, right? And this kind of approach allows me a different avenue of asserting their personhood and their identity within society and community. Right. So just going to give you a quick case example of sort of how this might work in reality and give us a different sort of views. An issue I worked a lot on, still work a lot on, is around prenatal testing and the termination of fetuses with disability-related traits. Primarily Down syndrome, spina bifida, but primarily Down syndrome. Okay? I'm sure most of you are aware that at the moment about 90% of fetuses identified with Down syndrome are terminated on the basis of them having Down syndrome. The response from the disability community to this was problematic. The primary response or argument from the disability community was something called the expressivist argument. Okay, and basically that was an argument that it's wrong to terminate these fetuses because of what it expresses in terms of attitudes towards disability and the impact that will have on persons currently living with disability. Okay? Now, there were a couple of reasons the argument went that way. One was in the States where a lot of this work was first done, abortion, as many of you know, is probably the most highly politicized issue. So they had to tread very, very carefully around the question of abortion, right? But what happened politically was it put the disability movement in direct conflict with the feminist movement. Because arguments about reducing or eliminating women's ability to terminate fetuses on the basis of disability were seen as limits to choice. Okay? As an impediment to women's right to choose. And it's gotten much better, but certainly in the early years of the debate and the political organizing around this, feminists were not lined up very well with the disability community based on this question of choice. And part of that was because the way we had the social model did not allow us a way to discuss the actual fetus. Because the social model because what is being identified in prenatal testing is impairment. Right? You're not identifying disability, you're identifying impairment in social model terms, right? So you're identifying Down syndrome, spina bifida, because it's pre-social, and if disability is socially determined, then there is no logical way you can describe this fetus as a disabled fetus.
Right, but the social attitudes towards the fetus are already there.
Well, towards who the fetus will become.
Okay, but
right? That's different, right? So that's why the expressivist argument was the dominant argument. What we couldn't, we didn't have the option was an identity-based argument, right? And what I mean by that, how do we respond to issues around the selection of male fetuses over female fetuses? Right? So even the most pro-choice advocate generally is not comfortable with the phenomena of selecting for sex. Okay? Because it's discriminating against a specific identity. Right? So by being able to characterize the fetus as part of an identity category equivalent to gender, it opens up a different line of argument for us that allows us to say, by terminating fetuses identified as having Down syndrome is equivalent to terminating female fetuses. So you can see that how that shifts the politics, and is a much, to my mind, a much stronger argument, and actually is one that has helped resolve this, not totally by any means, this conflict around this issue with the feminist movement, because that's something they can understand. Right? So we say, all right, logically you now have two choices. You can either not contest the selection of male fetuses, or you can accept that the selection of fetuses without disability-related traits is equivalent to selection of gender, and understand our opposition to the practice. It's fairly complicated, but you with me on this?
I think one of the important points you made is that even if this specific fetus is not yet born, the implication for the identity of all individuals that carry this identity and have already been born, this is a very, very strong implication for others that hear about the possibility, what does this say about me? I was not terminated, what does this imply about me? And this is
It just, I think, gives us a much stronger and expanded argument than we had available from a pure social model, right? And hopefully, I'm hoping this little example kind of gets some of the subtleties of what an embodiment identity model provides us with beyond what we get with the pure social model. Okay, so that's a quick little example. So in terms of some of the research implications, I think we've kind of talked about this. It opens up a lot more scope for personal exploration, experience of disability without falling back on a medical model approach. For example, I have a PhD student who's discovering or examining positive sexuality of women with disabilities. Right? So it's not about how do you accommodate, it's not about stigma, it's about, you know, how do women with disabilities experience sex, and do they experience it differently, and how do we promote the sexual rights of disabled women. So in this kind of model allows us to explore all the complexities of the body and all of that stuff in a positive kind of way. So it's not about, all right, what kind of devices do we need so that disabled women can have sex? It's about how do they experience it, and how do they enjoy that in the same way others kind of enjoy it in a much more intimate sort of way. So it gives us a little different, more scope. I think it provides a lot broader scope for research and more inclusive in terms of cross-disability groups. And I think it can provide a more positive basis for representations of disability. So if the medical model calls, here the social model calls for an end to externally created barriers, what the embodiment and identity model allows for is one to embrace and positively promote their identity as a disabled person, rather than simply as an oppressed minority that if we can get rid of the oppression disappears. And I think that's all I want to say.
we have about 10 minutes for questions and discussion.
Let's guess.
Oh, a long time ago though, right?
Long time.
You should pick who needs
Oh,
to
okay.
ask. I want to be the bad.
You do need to talk loud. I don't hear all that well. Please talk loud after you.
I will ask in Hebrew, please. חלק. רציתי לשאול לגבי הנושא של סבל. אם ידוע למשל שתסמונת מסוימת מביאה המון סבל פיזי לאדם, איך אנחנו מתייחסים לזה כאשר מגלים את התסמונת הזאת בזמן העוברות?
Asking about the issue of suffering, what do we do in cases when there is a specific syndrome that we know that does cause a lot of suffering, a lot of pain, and we know this a priori? How do we deal with it in the fetal stage?
Yes, so you're talking about that there are, very, very rare syndromes that people will be in intense pain and live very short lives. I don't have a magic answer. In what I do know to some extent, and not necessarily in that intense pain, but we've had cases of kids who are born with conditions where they will die, within 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 weeks. What some of the parents have said and done is they have argued that time is not necessarily a relevant factor in terms of their love of their child. So that's not really an answer to your question, but I think that this notion that somehow time or length is a relevant feature is not necessarily all in all. So we had a case in Canada where the hospital refused to treat. And relatively, in terms of life-sustaining treatment, relatively simple, straightforward kind of treatment. The hospital physician, but they're going to die within 2 or 3 months. There's no point treating them, it's a waste of resources. And the parents came back and said, for you maybe, but that's 3 months with my child. And that's important. Now the pain issue does complicate things, but I think the risk is we use what is a rare outlier case as the basis for a much broader set of cases. So I don't know what the answer is in that specific case. But what I don't want is that specific case to be used and the way it is for a much expanded approach. Because really those cases are really, really rare. And it's same on the other end. It's just suicide debate is a lot about people who are in intolerable pain. Palliative care physicians will tell you that actually very, very few people cannot have their pain mitigated at the end of life. All right, we'll go this way and then back over there. I don't want to bias the left side of the room, okay?
I will also, but prefer to say it in, I'll try in English, but you were talking mostly in your presentation about suffering as a personal thing. And I was wondering if suffering is a personal thing or it sits somewhere between the personal and the political or the social.
I think it's probably a whole mix of those things.
Yeah, I can understand pain can be personal. But I'm not sure suffering is not תוצאה, result of something, connection with society.
Yeah, and I mean, again, none of this stuff is simple. I do really think highly of a lot of the literature that, there isn't a lot, but there's a couple of U.S. feminist scholars who have written quite, I can't do their name right now, but who put the position, I'm not suffering, I'm struggling. And I'm struggling because I don't have sports and stuff. So then that one's fairly easy. That's kind of a classic social model. approach, right? So that one's fairly easy to deal with. The physical pain and suffering, I think, is where it cannot be ameliorated. So say we've done everything you can do and it's still there. I think that's really not something you can generalize about. I think that's such a personal experience and how people interpret that and how people want to use it. Some people will use pain as a basis for growth, for enlightenment. For others, it's none of those things. And so I don't know that you can generalize. I think where the biggest problem for me is the existential suffering, which is the existential suffering. And in fact, for instance, I just read a piece the other day in the Netherlands. The rate of assisted suicides for people with mental health issues only, who describe their suffering as existential suffering, has gone from 14 in the last census to 160. It's the fastest growing group of assisted suicide. And that scares me. So the whole thing of the existential anxiety is I think problematic, and you know, I don't have an answer, and I don't think there is an answer. And for me, politically, the issue around assisted suicide is risk to the vulnerable. I don't have any absolute problem with assisted suicide. What I have a problem with is how it creates vulnerability to other groups, and I think that category is one of the more vulnerable groups. But I do think from a philosophical perspective, how many people tell me the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism?
There's suffering in the world.
What is the first of the Four Noble Truths?
Nothing is stable.
No, there's suffering in the world.
Life is suffering. All life is suffering.
There is a source.
Yeah. So all. So I mean there are. Well, I might have got my order wrong, but so there are, you know, philosophical. I mean, we can debate this all day. Again, for me, that's not the problem we have to solve in terms of the political problem of assisted suicide, but it is an interesting problem.
Take one last question.
Just wanted to understand better what is the role or responsibility of the society according to the identity model. I mean, if somebody has the identity of being disabled, does the society have to do something according to this?
You know, I don't think the identity model invalidates anything in the social model. Right, so absolutely, there's an awful lot. There's an awful lot society has to do. I think like any identity-based politics, what they're asking of society is recognition. And I think that's the same for women. Civil rights movement, what you're ultimately asking for is recognition as a value, but different and unique part of the human fabric. From an identity, I think that's maybe what they add to the social model approach.
Okay. I know all of you have lots of questions. We'll have breaks, and you can try to get anyone you want during this break, during the pretty long lunch break. And anything you don't get answered, these guys will have 3 weeks in Armenia that have lots of free time to answer questions. I'll send over any urgent questions. We'll take a break until 11:05. We're all seated?
Yes.
Okay, 11:05. And Lily will put a presentation up, and you can have coffee and cookies. Okay. Anyone doesn't know the university, there's a washroom down the hall.
אנחנו צריכים לעשות את זה בעמידה.
ולהרצאה של שיעור שנתי, הסדר, על
הנושא של סטיגמה ותפיסה ומודל רפואי ותרבויות ואני עושה להם את ההמשגה. ואני עובדת בעצם בקבוצה הקטנה על המשגה הם עובדים במפעלים מוגנים, זה עכשיו מוגנים, עכשיו בבית החולים ואני עושה להם את קשה לומר, אני לא יודעת. בתפיסה שלי, גם בפרקטיקה שעבדתי ההשגה של זה, שנה האחרונה שחברתי פה למרכז, מתחומים שעושים חומרים שייקספיר
כן, גם פעם שעברה היה אתה חושב איזה 3 שעות של ספורט, זה,
יש שם אני לא יודעת, דווקא משתתפתי דווקא בחלק של הרסות של האדם זה נכון שבמקומות מסוימים קצת
אוי, את עדיין לא קשה. אני לא חפשתי
Which one is better?
אני עובדת
גם רוצים לשנות את זה,
Then you have to start with the
זה חסר. לא יודעת כמה. יש לי שניים.
אני מאוד אוהבת עולם העבודה מנציח אי שוויון, מנציח הדרה, מנציח וגם תפקידם של תעסוקתית אז מה תפקידם בתוך התהליך היום זה קצת אז אני בתוך שם סלט מתוך היהודים סלט שחור כל מיני ניואנסים זה אחד וחצי עדיף אבל זה גם גם אם האדם רוצה לשלב את כל הקבוצה של יש כל מיני אינפלייטס כאלה חייב להיות שימושים אחרים הגדרות שונות לכל אדם זה פרסונל
אין אינסנטיב של עובד יותר נסבל יותר גם
לא. אפשר לפרש את מה שכתב במקום הזה. וזה היה להיות השיח של איך זה בשלב הזה. יש לי ביקורתיות גם על התוצאות. אנחנו לא קשים אותה, אבל היא לא
Imagine that I'm bringing the bell and you're actually sitting down and going to listen to me. Our next speaker is Lily Breuer, who is actually only here for a visit, but she came to visit at the right time because it ties well with what you said before, because our last research meeting that was, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks ago, was about disability arts, and Lily was part of this meeting as well, and it was a great meeting, and I think most of the people who were in this meeting were like, we've never heard this before because we're used to arts in terms of, doing arts therapy and things like that. So it really ties in well. And Lily is still here in rotation, so we're trying to cover her work a bit. And Lily is a PhD candidate in the Disability Studies program at Illinois University. And she's going to be speaking about stigma and autoethnography, exploring the transition from first person to third person. And she will probably do better also in introducing musicians.
Thank you. Thank you, Lily. And I'm glad to be here today. Should I introduce myself more? Okay, so I'm working in the field of disability studies before I even know that there is a field of disability studies. I was a student here in the Hebrew University in the beginning of 2000, And I studied sociology and anthropology. I started to be very passionate about feminist approach, about the body, about identities, about oppression, and it resonated with me very deeply, and I connected it to disability. Never know that there is already theories that talk specifically about disability in the context of society, culture, and oppression. And I invented the wheel, and later on I only started to learn and know about the different models, about the different approach, about the discourse that most of us don't learn, especially in Israel, don't learn in the Israeli context. Only in the recent years we have courses of Professor who teach it, and this center, new center that started 1 year ago, 3 years ago? This year. And so only now it's becoming a bit more accessible for students in the university, and hopefully also for activists outside of the university. And one of the entrance to the field of disability was actually Stigma of Goffman. And even though it was not acknowledged as part of the field of disability study, I reclaimed it as part of this field. And I will explain why I think it's another approach to think and theorize disability in a political, social context, even though it not necessarily came from that approach. And I will connect it also for what Tim and Ronnie already said before about the different model and why is it unique. Although I'm starting now talking about stigma, in my presentation I'm going to be focused about autoethnography as a specific method to think about the body, identity, and oppression. So that's going to be the vast part of my lecture, but I will start more with the issue of stigma. I will argue that most of us have important stories to tell about society, and having to be part of a specific culture, a specific group, giving us knowledge about that group. But a lot of the time we are not aware of that knowledge. We see it as the common way to live, to think, to be. And being in a minority, being in the margin of society, being excluded, being the outcast, actually challenge this common knowledge and this perspective that this is the true reality, this is the natural reality, is put in question mark when you are an outcast. So I will argue that even though most of us have stories, important stories to tell about society, people that are oppressed have unique and important stories to tell that are important from two perspectives. One of them is giving a voice to people in the margin that are not given a voice or a subjective identity that they create themselves and not being talked about from the outside, from the center of society. So being empowered because of having a voice and creating your own stories in your own words is one perspective why autoethnography and telling our own stories in our own voice is important. The other one is that because we are in the margin, we see society in a very different way than people in the center see society. And that gives us a different perspective, more critical, I will say, perspective about the hegemonic, dominant culture that most people are not taking a pause to think about more critically. Frantz Fanon is a very known psychoanalytician. I don't know exactly how to say it. Psychoanalyst, thank you. לא, חרפה זה אחר כך. So Frantz Fanon is a very known psychoanalyst, and he is considered to be one of the founders of post-colonial theory. It's thinking about the dominance of the West on the East and how the whole race power relation is affecting even after the colonial went back to their state. And in this specific quote that I'm going to read, he explained one of his terms, that is third person consciousness, תודעה בגוף שלישי, that he explained how the oppressed black people in this context are learned to see themselves from a white gaze, from the dominant culture that identify them as the other and conceptualize what that means. So I will read this short quote so you will have a better understanding what exactly it means. מצאת את זה? זה עכשיו הציטוט. My body was given back to me, sprawled out, distorted, recolored, clad in mourning in that white winter day. The Negro is an animal. The Negro is bad. The Negro is mean. The Negro is ugly. Look, a nigger. It's cold. The nigger is shivering. The nigger is shivering because he is cold. Wait. The Negro is shivering with cold. That cold that goes through your bones. The handsome little boy is trembling because he thinks that the Negro is quivering with rage. The little white boy thrown himself into his mother's arms. Mama, the Negro is going to eat me up. So I will argue that what Fanon is actually doing here was later going to be called autoethnography. He's using his own narrative, his own experience, to tell stories about society, about the society that he lives in. In this context, he's in France. And he tells the stories from his own perspective. He is not trying to tell the hegemonic dominant narrative about the black people, but actually using his own experience to create an alternative voice, an alternative representation of blackness. And this blackness is having context. And in this case, the context is the fear of a little child, white child, that see Fanon and identify him as a Negro and connect it very, very directly for something that you need to fear from. So this experience is not coming from a neutral, objective perspective that the researcher is telling us after doing an empirical work. It's coming from his experience in daily life that is very politicized and very embodied. The body of Fanon in his work is very significant. It's not something that he can forget about or dismiss because it's in the norm, and we can experience our body as not here. Coming from an oppressed group, and even more from a disability context, in my case, we experience our body daily. This body is identified by the other and being learned in a different way from space, from media, from culture, from very that stuff that's considered to be insignificant, but telling us the story of society, of who we are in the dominant perspective. And now I will connect it back to the concept of stigma. So as I said, I learned of Goffman in sociology very early in my academic life, and one of the phrases that he's using to talk about stigma is the following: "He is reduced in our minds from a whole and usual person to a tainted, discounted one. By definition, we believe the person with the stigma is not quite human. So this is a significant part of the definition of what stigma means. It means that from the normal perspective, the other is not part of the human nature, the human group. And the identity is becoming tainted. It's not a normal identity from the eyes of society, but it's a damaged identity that the person, when understanding this context, actually experiencing her own identity through that mediation of society. As a member of society, we create our identity in context. It's not something that we are born with. We create it in our society. And when society reflects back to us that our identity is not normal, is not okay, is not human, our identity is going to be damaged also from our own perspective most of the time. And I will also add here why I'm thinking that stigma is a distinct theory in the context of disability studies that is not the medical model, it's not the social model, and it's not the identity model. One of the ways that I suggest to see stigma as a theory is this. I don't know. I will tell you the image in the screen. There is two boys in a pool. One of them looking back and recognizing that there is two girls that share a body, and he is now staring at them, and they look back to him. So the way that I conceptualize stigma in this image is considered also the stare of the boy that looking, and the stare back of the two girls that looking back, and now there is this encounter, this connection that creates meaning for both of the side. It's dialectic. It's not something that we can create a very clear split, a binary between what is social, what is the impairment, or where exactly the identity lies. In here we see how interaction is in the base of disability, and how relationship is the part that creates our identities. And from that point, Goffman, when he analyzed stigma, he actually going against, or very cynical, I would say, about identity politics. He do not embrace that approach, and that is actually one of the criticism against Goffman in disability studies, that he doesn't acknowledge the importance of disability movement, for example, in creating a different reality for us all. But I will say that in the theory itself, it's not very clear connection between this stigma and the tainted identity and identity politics. So we need to create this distinction. I will move on to my own narrative, and I hope that it will resonate also with Finon narrative. So here we go. When I seek to know my body, to be a spokesperson for it to myself and to others, it becomes unclear, even to me. Are you a mother or a girl? This I did know. I am not a mother, nor am I a girl. It's a doll? Touch it. No one touched me. I am not a doll. Why is she little? My degree of difficulty increased considerably. Why am I little? Those questions penetrated me, pounding through my eardrums, pulling my personal body out of my hands. Joint disease, genetics, mutation becomes referenced, which minimize me to a medical problem. Those are the explanations issued to me by the same culture that created the need for those questions, a need that did not exist prior and did not have to exist, an answer that could have been different. A child to whom I responded with the heredity answer, the answer that was most concrete and logical, came back to me again with the same question. Why are you little? The answers I gave will never be satisfactory, nor not even for me. But I felt at the time, and still do to a certain extent, that those were the only acceptable answers I had to give. So having a lot of questions that created my identity as a question mark, created a puzzle, created an anxiety, created trauma in a lot of ways and sense, that turned me to see my body as a problem, see myself as something that needs to be fixed, and something that I need to explore and start to understand better, because obviously I didn't know enough, because society all the time asked me questions, and the children was the one that expressed it, that society created those questions for them and for me. And I tried to create answers or to find the answer in our culture, and the answer that I found was the one that already created another problem for me, because in the medical model or the medical paradigm, we actually are understanding and constructing disability, impairment, differences as problems, as something that is necessarily lacking, negative, something that needs to be fixed, and trying to identify myself through those concepts, through this rhetoric, created difficulties. It's not something that you want to accept or create your identity on, base your identity on. So the question continue on, and I will say I will only mention shortly to say that disability study and also disability art became two of the spaces that offer me creating new languages, new knowledge, not be satisfied with the very problematic answers that are already given to me by the dominant culture. But having this narrative, having this reflection on my own experience in a more political, more alternative way of thinking, opened a road for me. This narrative is like the beginning of a journey. I will shortly explain what autoethnography means. So it's coming from this different word of auto, that means self, ethnos, that means nation, and grapho, that means to write. So it's actually creating stories about a nation, about specific culture, a specific group, that are being wrote in the first person from the self. And Reed Danahy is one of the researchers of this method, and she explains that the different aspects of autoethnography can have different percent or emphasis in the writing of autoethnography. Some people will put more of their attention on the self, others can put more about society. So there is a lot of flexibility in that sense. I will also read that citation from Ellis and Adams and Wuchner. Autoethnography, it is an approach to research and writing that seeks to describe and systematically analyze personal experience in order to understand cultural experience. So it's again starting from the self, but we are not ending with the self. We are aiming to know better the context, the society that we are living in. I will also read that quick citation, I hope it's fine, from Ellis and Buchner. I start with my personal life. They explain the process. So they start with their personal life. I pay attention to my physical feelings. It's again the body, how we experience ourselves, our bodies. So also the thoughts and emotions. I use what I call systematic sociological introspection and emotional recall to try to understand and experience I've lived through. Then I write my experience as a story. By exploring a particular life, I hope to understand a way of life. So it's again coming from the personal and connecting it to the social and the political. In disability study, I will argue that the political is very significant. It's very important to use the stories to think politically about disability and society. Oh, I see that it's quite long. I will still read it. It's another of my own narrative. It's created when I joined a group of wheelchair folk dancing in Israel that I wanted to be part of and study as a participant observer. And this is the first time that I joined the group. It is the first meeting of the group. The first dance begins, and I'm on my feet. It's fun and it's tiring. The next song begins, and I'm still dancing, but my feet wish to dispute that. A slight pain. My body will not continue to obey much longer. I go to the instructor and ask to be excused for a moment. I go to the parking lot and pull out the wheelchair which I brought just in case. Out it comes slowly, and I head back to the dance floor. I enter and my eyes turn downward. I feel uncomfortable showing up with this crutch of mine. I am a sitter now, not a stander. Those are the identities in the group, as they call it here. I get a partner, a stander. We try to execute the moves, but it's a flop. How can you do partner dance in a wheelchair, especially with a mechanized one? We draw defeated to one of the benches, watching the disabled dance as best they can. Their faces are happy, smiling, light up, and I can't understand how come they enjoy themselves and how can anybody even call it dancing. A few minutes ago, I was looking down at them, but as a stander, I am only good for 10 minutes, and as a sitter, I'm worthless. Shame and frustration overwhelm me. So this experience of mine on changing the identities, the different roles in the group, created a deep frustration and feeling of shame because I needed to move from my privileged position as the one that's able to stand and move on the feet to using a wheelchair. And even though that this group was aimed for wheelchair user, I experienced that shift as inferior, as something that is not, I wasn't anyway proud in that. I was ashamed in this shift and this exposure of my disability, my limitation. And the point that I want to emphasize is how my eyes, this is the tool of observance, yes, we see it in the name, that speaks of faith. I lose my ability to look at the field. My eyes went downward because I was ashamed and I didn't want to see the reflection of others, other participants of who I am now. I put a lot of attention on how people look at me because I learned in a very early age the power of others on my identity, on who I am. So that experience of losing eyesight, of being more focusing on myself and my own feeling, my body feeling, was the point, I will argue it's the point when I lose my position as participant observant and went for the alternative method of autoethnography. I became a significant part of the issue of the research. It's not I'm looking at them, research them, it's I'm researching us in this specific context of wheelchair dancing, and the tension going to be reflect on my own experience also, and not only on the outside. And that is a significant shift when we think about method in sociology, anthropology, and of course in disability study when we emphasize and giving privilege to the stories that are coming from disabled people, this shift is extremely significant. Because I can I'm sorry that I'm reading so many texts, but I hope you are fine with that. So another quote of Newman about autoethnography, texts that democratize the representational sphere of culture by locating the particular experiences of individuals in a tension with dominant expressions of discursive power. So I will explain. It's the person is actually emphasizing again the political edge of autoethnography. As I said before, everybody can use autoethnography. People also from the dominant culture can reflect back on society and on their own identity. But the value, the big value of autoethnography is exploring the tension between the dominant narrative, the dominant expectation, the discursive power that he's talking about, and how we as individuals experience our body, the situation that we are in, and recognizing the tension, recognizing that we are not fully in the normal expectation or the normal narrative that are expected from us. I will connect it back with disability by saying that one of the very powerful and central narrative that our society is using in the context of disability is the overcoming. People that are disabled and succeeded כביכול, איך אומרים כביכול? Allegedly succeeded to become better than what is expected of them, go beyond the limitation of their bodies or mind, are stories that we know, we feed from the media very strongly, and we learn also to appreciate. In autoethnography and also in disability study, there is a criticism, of course, about this framework, and there is an alternative way of approaching our own stories and creating more emphasis on the problematic expectation and the problematic normalization that people that are different are expected all the time to be ashamed of this difference and try to disattach themselves from the body and from the identity that are being assigned to us, and also from the political movement that this oppression also created in the context of disability and other groups. So when we thinking about overcoming, there is no tension. Yeah, it's a smooth story in the eyes of the dominant culture. It's something that is considered to be heroic, being considered to be very positive, teach the normal people that we all need to strive better for ourselves, and teach the normal people also that we need to believe in the individual, to be capable to integrate and to give the chance. So this is like a story that we really love to hear, not you necessarily, but the society that we are in, and coming from an approach that wish to emphasize and prioritize tension, this story will not exist. The other story will say about suffering, will say about oppression, will talk about conflict, will talk about dilemmas, ambivalency. It's creating a much more complex stories that recognize society and context in the oppressive side, and also maybe the opportunities that some of us are being given, but also recognizing our bodies, our feeling in different situations. It's not trying to create a Hollywoodic stories about disability or some kind of empowering story. It's actually talking about the complexity that we are living in. So that tension is important also politically, and maybe this is one of the reasons, another reason, why I'm thinking that it's a different approach than identity politics, that trying to think more about empowerment or to think about the positive part of the identity of disabled people. It's talking about the complexity more. So there is, of course, a problem to judge, to identify which work will be considered to be very good author ethnography and other that will be considered to be less good. And there is no one criteria or a group of criteria that are accepted in the field, in the research, but there are some suggestions, so I will emphasize one of them. So aesthetic qualities, how the narrative, how the reflection of the narrative is being presented aesthetically. The reflexivity, how much the person is devoted of examining the narrative, the experience in first person, and reflect on that, not only telling a story, but actually analyzing the story in a critical eyes. Stay there? Okay. Impact on the reader, how people that are going to read the literature, the written part, are going to be impact, and also authenticity. And another criteria that I actually really like, that Eisner suggested, is number and quality of the questions that the work raises. So it's not supposed to give an answers, it's give to raise more and more questions, and hopefully deeper one about society and so on. I will give another example, hopefully shortly, about the importance of reflectivity and the analytical part. So it's another narrative that I will read. As a young girl, I feared to go to the grocery store. The closest one was in the absorption center, Merkaz Klita, for new immigrants, mostly populated by Ethiopians. Children were always a risk, and Ethiopian kids were the worst, as they would roam in gangs, and the boys would react very vocally and rudely to my height. It still happens, even now. I walk in the mall, a bunch of Ethiopian kids notice me. They shout, they laugh, they point, excited by the unexpected discovery. I glare at them and then look away. I keep walking, but they don't stop. Rather, they follow me. I keep my gaze firmly ahead and keep going, as if I don't see them, as if I will not see them, as if I could escape their eyes. So this narrative is a very intense experience of being stared at by a group of people, a group of children. In this case, it's Ethiopian children. And when I wrote this narrative for my thesis long years ago, and my advisor, that her main research is post-colonial research theory, Louise Betlechem, told me that I need to analyze it
very deeply because I cannot only talk about myself as being stared at in this context, because Ethiopian children also being stared at, also being stigmatized, also being oppressed in our society. So this complexity of the narrative demanded me to go deeper than being only the victim and experience it very intense, to think why is that happening so significantly in this context of Ethiopian children. And I will say very shortly that one of the insights that I had from my interpretation was that because of the oppression of Ethiopians in our society, there was celebrating a white woman differences that becoming more extreme, more visible in their eyes. So my body actually made them more normal. So they could, again, this is my interpretation. Everybody can argue different. But for me, the analytical edge was that because of different group oppression, the context created such a big conflict and tension between us that they celebrated their own normality in this new context of one individual that is more different and inferior maybe than them, that the power relation changed in that encounter, and they can celebrate their own body by making my body so inferior and problematic. So that context created a new way of thinking about stigma, about society, about power relations in a way that theory most of the time doesn't go to. We used to think about different oppressions and sometimes finding the similarities, but not going very deep about the conflict and tension that we can experience in our daily life. And now the context is all the time influenced. It's not only a cultural thing that I can say Ethiopian children will probably be more loud about differences. It's also about the context of oppression. And I think I will end here. Yeah.
6 minutes per question.
Hi, I just wanted to ask about you say stigma as a different model or a different theory, and if you could talk about why it's different than the social model or why it's different from the identity model, because I see a lot of it in the social model and in the identity model.
So I will go back to the image of the children.
אני אגיד בעברית, שהיא אומרת שסטיגמה זה כאילו תיאוריה שונה, ואני שואלת איפה היא מתחברת למודל החברתי ואיפה היא מתחברת למודל של הזהות, כי אני רואה אותה בתוך שני המודלים האלה ולא בתור משהו שונה.
Yeah, definitely it's not a very sharp distinction in the meaning that they are not overlap at all, but I will say that it's a distinct perspective to think about disability. Maybe I will start with what are the similarities. So in the social model and in stigma, we can see the importance of context. It's not thinking about disability or the body, the impaired body, as something that is living in vacuum. Vacuum? But there is a very significant attention to context, to society that created and construct disability. So that is a big part of similarities. But there is also emphasis on the self and the experience of the body and the identity. Stigma talks about the tainted identity, how society create identities and damage them by disgracing people, oppressed people. And that part of identity of the body, has already been said by Ronnie and Tim,
are not being emphasized in the social model. So that is a big addition of stigma. I will also say that significant addition to this, to the other models or theories about disability is how encounters, daily encounters, are creating our identities, our experience of the self, of the body, and we are actually focused more on the micro than the macro. What? So, and the social model is very focusing on the macro, the medical model is very focused on the body without any context, and the identity model that I think that is also having a lot of overlap with stigma is still, I would argue, is not the same as stigma because, and I'm using more of Goffman perspective, so maybe other theories in the field of stigma arguing it differently, but in Goffman is actually criticizing identity politics, arguing that tainted identities will never be fixed. We can never empower ourselves to experience our identity or our bodies as whole, as normal, because we created a new perspective or a new ideology about this body. Because the context, and I would say the power relation, will never allow that to happen fully. So in that way, identity politics that believe that the movement can create a significantly different experience of the self, and we should strive for that, is one approach, and stigma thinking, again, through Goffman approach, thinking very differently about this politics.
More questions?
Okay, thanks. I would like to understand how ethnography is related to agency. Because one of the critique I have towards the traditional social model of disability, that it views disabled people merely or mostly as victims, without, I think, giving them enough agency, at least in theory, not in political level, and thus, or put it another way, it overlooks the way disabled people are also negotiate, reject, and sometimes even capable of overcome discrimination and so on. And I would like to understand how ethnography relates to agency in this regard. It looks like it gives a lot of room to agency, but I couldn't understand exactly how it does and give agency.
In Hebrew, I will say the הרמה להפתה. I don't know how to translate.
We'll bring it up in order to bring it down.
So agency is significantly part in thinking also of stigma and of course autoethnography. It's giving a voice autoethnography for the subject that experience the oppression in this context and experience the stigma.
The same goes for the social models. Exactly. At least theoretically gives voices to people with disabilities.
Yeah.
Okay.
You ask what the difference is in that?
What is the unique way of ethnography in terms of giving voices and agency to disabled people?
Oh, so I think it's the complexity of the stories that we can tell from autoethnography and from stigma theoretical approach. It's not trying to make the binary between impairment and disability, between where my body starts and ends and where society starts and ends. It's complecting them, creating a story that you can never identify exactly binaries or distinct separation between the body, the self, and society. To go back to the question about suffering, I think you asked that. You? Okay. I wanted to answer that, so I will take this part to answer that. I also have experienced pain in my body, and coming from a more critical approach, I know that the way that I interpret my pain is always also culture. It's not saying that the body doesn't experience it. It's not in the body, but it's also all the time being interpreted in my mind, my body mind, as a problem. And that adds to the suffer. And we can never distinguish between those part of the suffering and how society reacts, the service that I'm getting, the economical perspective are going to also impact my suffering. So we can, in autoethnography and in stigma, I would argue we can create much more complex stories that doesn't want us to find a very clear answer, a very simplistic answer of society is the blame, the body is the blame. Or okay, if I would think differently about my body, now I'm safe because I'm empowered. And it's accepting all of those angles, but still keeping them in question mark and seeing the ambivalency in them. So I'm a big believer of gam vegam.
Both.
Not both. It's
all together.
All together. I don't know.
It's not either or, but it's this and that.
Right. It's a kind of having flexibility in our own life, of choosing the strategic or tactic that will be the most useful for us in that context, and having also the ability to reflect on that and thinking also politically about the tactic that I choose and what is the benefit of it and what is the limitation of it or the problem. So I think that option is giving a lot of agency to the person without dismissing power relation, oppression, context, cultural context. Yes,
לא. לענות לשאלות בהמשך. I'm sorry that I have to be so timely.
Maybe one more question, because we're waiting for the other one.
The only thing is probably try to call her because she's probably just outside. תודה. תתפסו אותה. We are going
כן, אני הולכת
לא, עשית עצר. עכשיו אני ממשיך.
תראה לי לפעם הבאה.
זה עושה עצר. תודה.
Okay. We have our last talk for this time, and afterwards you will have a bigger break. But if you don't behave now, you will not have a bigger break. We're taking time off our speakers. So we have the pleasure of having two speakers together, and we have Brian Avery and Renata Tisha from the Institute of Community Integration at the University of Minnesota. And for those of you that were not there yesterday, you know, all of our things are always videotaped. I should let you know all of our things are videotaped if you haven't noticed, and they will be up on our Facebook. So if you weren't there yesterday, you're welcome. You will see their wonderful presentations from yesterday. Now we will be speaking about measuring quality and impact of home and community-based services for persons with disabilities, development and utilization of new measures. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. By the way, I'm Brian, that's Renata. And we are very pleased to be here to get a chance to share with you some of the work that we are doing at our Institute on Community Integration. We have within our institute a lot of different centers, and one of the centers is our Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Home and Community Based Services Outcome Measurement. This is research which is very different from the research that's been described so far today. But essentially a problem was brought to us, and we were asked if we could kind of apply our understanding of measurement, our understanding of assessment to help solve this problem. The problem we have is that we have a program called Home and Community-Based Services, which provides opportunities for people with disabilities who qualify for Medicaid services to receive services in their own home or in some type of supported living situation within the community. Our living situations within the community now, at least in Minnesota, typically are 2 or 3 people with disabilities living in a home within a community with the supports that they need. The supports could be somebody who is a home health aide coming into a home where an individual is living with a partner or a family member and providing very limited supports, or it could be much more significant supports being provided to somebody who has fairly significant support needs because of an intellectual and developmental disability. Now, the programs that fall under this home and community service-based label are really different. As I said, they range from minimal supports to quite intensive 24-hour, 7-day-a-week supports. And they're provided to people with a wide variety of different disabilities. Now, this program, Medicaid, which by the way is a program which under our current administration is under threat for having very intensive significant budget cuts, which is one of the reasons why measuring outcomes we think is important, basically is provided on a state-to-state basis. So, each state tends to administer the program a little bit differently. One of the things that really helped people with disabilities in the United States is that when the Affordable Care Act was passed by Congress a few years ago, it expanded the benefits to people with disabilities and really helped a lot of people with disabilities of different types, of different ages, get supports within the communities, living with their families, living with people of their choice, rather than being in more institutionalized. Now, to give you an idea of why it's important to measure the outcomes associated with these services, take a look at the amount of money that's spent in the United States, and this is, I think, a 2014 estimate on home and community-based services. $80.6 billion. That's a lot of money that the federal government is contributing to those services.
Sorry. What kind of services are you talking about? Health services or also?
I've talked about that just a minute ago. It's home services and aids. It's services to support people who are living in the community who might need somebody to cook for them. Okay. In some cases, it's nursing services, or small living arrangements for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, personal care attendants. So it's really a wide variety of services for a wide variety of people with different types of disabilities, of different levels of support needs. Okay, it is not health services. That's one of the things that kind of is outside of the home and community-based service perspective. So again, a lot of money is being spent to provide services and supports to people so they live in the community. And there are a lot of different tools that have been developed over the years to measure the outcomes associated with home and community-based services. But there are some problems with those tools. They focus on a whole bunch of different types of outcomes. Some focus primarily on the personal outcomes that people with disabilities experience. Others focus on what we call quality assurance measures. They're not focused on people's personal outcomes, but our organizations who provide these services doing certain things for people that the people may or may not want. Because one of the problems with these tools is that they don't tend to be person-centered. Okay? The way these tools are administered differs by state. In some states, literally, a person comes into your home, and they administer a survey to you. They ask you a set of questions, question 1 followed by question 2, and they might spend a half an hour to an hour and a half with you, asking you to provide them with information about how you're experiencing life and the quality of services you're receiving. And it really is a pretty much kind of by format set of questions and answers. In other states, the programs are administered very differently, or these assessments, and a person will come in who has a much higher level of training as an interviewer, and will have a conversation with you. And that conversation will try to get at what's important to you, how you are kind of experiencing life, and then they will then go back and fill out kind of these questions to try to provide that same information to the individuals who kind of are supporting, funding these programs and administering these programs. The idea here is that, if we really want to understand the experiences of people with disabilities and whether the funding we're providing for home and community-based services is being well spent, we have to ask people what their experiences are when they're receiving these services. Are these experiences allowing them to really achieve desired life outcomes? Are these experiences supporting them to be of the community rather than just to be physically present within the community? And very important to both Renata and me and the people who we are working with is, are these experiences really allowing them to achieve in life what's important to them as opposed to what others think is important for them? So we really are trying to focus on developing measurement systems which focus on things in a very person-centered way. Right now, that is not what our measurement systems look like. Okay, even the best measurement systems that we have, tend to not be person-centered. They tend to focus on things which, quote, experts think is important for people with disabilities to experience. And they're administered in so many different ways that it's almost impossible for us to understand whether there are differences in the outcomes experiences by people with disabilities who live in different states, whether there are differences in outcomes experienced by people who have different types of disabilities who may be receiving any of these wide variety of services, including a combination of these services. So, what I'd like you to do is, just for a minute, put yourself in the shoes of somebody in each of the following roles. Because these are all individuals who are, I would call them stakeholders in the system of supports. A person with a disability, a family member with a person with a disability, somebody who provides these types of services, and somebody who administers these types of programs at a state level or sometimes at a federal level. For each of these stakeholder groups, think about what you believe would be the most important outcomes to measure associated with people receiving these home and community-based services. Think about what issues or problems you would want, these tools and the data collected to be able to address. Because it makes no sense to just go out and collect data. We need to use this data in a certain way. And then, what characteristics would you want these tools, these measures, to have? Such as not take more than a half an hour to administer, be easy to administer, or most important to Renata and I, are they providing us with a valid and reliable estimate of the experiences that people with disabilities are having when they are recipients of these services? So, if we look at the critical characteristics, we call them HCBS outcome measures. These are some of the things that, we think are critically important. And probably the first one is that these measures are, in fact, person-centered. And I would suggest that most of the measures that we're currently using are not. They don't ask people whether they are experiencing the social relationships they desire to experience. They ask people about how many friends do you have. Well, for Tim, having 2 good friends may be sufficient for him to really experience himself as being of the community, to get sufficient social supports. For me, I might need 5 friends to have that same experience. And most of our current measures do not do that. We want them to be feasible and usable. We want those measures to be able to drive an improvement of services. And we want them to focus on the outcomes which are most important to people with disabilities. As we've gone into this 5-year project, one of the things that we constantly keep telling ourselves is, nothing about us without us. We want them to be valid. We want them to be kind of valid in a social way, in a content way, and, to really embody all those other aspects of validity that we talk about in measurement. We want them to be sensitive to change over time, but even though these are all very kind of important aspects or characteristics of outcome measures, we really want to make sure that, these measures drive an improvement of services. Because we know that while the home and community-based services we're currently providing to people with disabilities in the United States are an improvement over, obviously an improvement over what they experienced in institutions, and even what they experienced a decade ago. We have a long way to go before we're providing a set of supports and services that meets everybody's needs. So what we've done, and I think what we want to do today, is focus on the process that we are trying to employ to really improve measurement in this area, is we propose and we're funded by our Administration on Community Living and our National Institute on Disability and Independent Living Research to do 5 years of kind of measurement improvement research in this area. And there are 6 different studies that we are conducting in order to kind of move through this process, and we hope end up with a set of measures that are better and that can allow us to more effectively deliver services to people with disabilities that help them to achieve the outcomes in life that they desire. We're going to talk today about kind of study 1 and study 2. The other studies, Renato will talk about kind of in a very brief format because we haven't gotten there yet. And our notion is, unless we can really do a good job with these first 2 studies, studies 3 through 6 don't make any difference. So, we were charged with kind of starting out with a given. Okay, and that is starting out with a given. Okay, with a framework that has been developed by a group in Washington called the National Quality Forum. Okay, it's a fancy term for a bunch of experts who got together and said, we're going to determine what we think are the most important outcomes for people with disability to achieve and therefore for us to measure. And the most important outcomes that we should be measuring within the home and community-based service system. Now, this group, and I'll describe this group to you a little bit more in a minute, came up with what they call 11 broad domains that they thought were most important to measure. And they include things like control and choice over one's life, and the services one gets and receives, a respect and a support for human and legal rights, community inclusion, holistic health and functioning. This workforce area has to do with having a stable workforce, people who provide you with supports. Caregiver support. In the United States, over 50% of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are adults receive supports from their family members. They are not in community residential programs, but they're actually living home with mom and dad and siblings. Person-centered planning and service coordination. Are we planning for services and delivering services in a way that truly is person-centered? Outcomes having to do with service delivery and effectiveness. Somebody needs new services. Did they get those services within a reasonable amount of time, within a short period of time? Are we delivering services in an equitable manner? Does where one live, does the color of one's skin, one's ethnic group membership, one's primary language have an impact on the services he or she receives? Then there are a couple of other things that focus on system performance and accountability. Are we collecting data that allows systems to be held accountable? And finally, to what degree is this entire system, at a local level, at a state level, at a national level, really involving consumers, people who receive home and community-based services and supports in system development. In other words, are we going to people with disabilities and allowing them to drive the services and supports that we receive? Now, within each of these broad areas, there are a whole number of sub-areas they're called subdomains, which this National Quality Forum said, we think these are important to measure. I'm not going to go over these because we'll share the slides with you, and in essence, they're not that important with respect to the 45 minutes we have to describe the process that we are using here. What's most important for you to understand is that this group of experts didn't think it was important to socially validate this framework for home and community-based service outcome measurement with the people who are receiving the services. You know, it was a group of people who sat in Washington for 3 days, all of whom had MDs and PhDs after their names, who said, we think we know what's most important for people with disabilities to receive for services, and we think we know the outcomes that are most important for them to receive. And this just wasn't a group of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. This was a much broader group of people with disabilities. People with physical disabilities, people with traumatic brain injury, people with psychiatric disabilities, people with, all sorts of different disabilities, including age-related disabilities. So what we thought is that we can't ignore the fact that we haven't yet kind of really taken this framework to people and asked them, does this make sense to you? Is this the most important stuff to measure? And just as important, if we use this framework, are we measuring the things that people from different stakeholder groups think are important and people from different disability groups think are important? I'm not sure whether the outcomes that people with physical disabilities think are most important to measure are the same as people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or people with traumatic brain injury, or people with age-related disabilities. So what we felt is that we first had to go out to people and kind of gain the input of critical stakeholders. And so we used a process which I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing, called participatory planning and decision making. We went out and we presented this model to groups of stakeholders and then asked them to critique this model, to tell us, what do you think we should retain in this model? What do you think is good? What do you think is important to you? And what do you think is not important? And we can toss that stuff out because this model is not in its final form. And so we went and conducted a series of 58 of these groups across the United States, on the West Coast, on the East Coast, in the southern states, in the Midwestern states. And we tried to get the input of as many people with disabilities, it was over 300 individuals, and other stakeholder groups as we could using this participatory planning and decision-making process. In essence, it is a focus group with numbers. Okay, we get people's input, we get people's ideas as to how they think this framework could be improved, and then we take those ideas and have them rate the importance of each of them on a 0 to 100 point scale. We want to know, what do you think is most important to measure to provide you with home and community-based services that meet your needs, that are person-centered, okay, and that essentially allow you to achieve the outcomes in life that you want. We're also interested in kind of figuring out whether different stakeholder groups have kind of consensus as to what the most important things to measure were, whether there were differences between those groups. We presently went into this thinking that, honestly, there might be some core things that all the groups think are important, but gosh, having physical accessibility to, let's say, a community center is probably going to be a little bit more important for somebody who uses a wheelchair than somebody who doesn't have to worry about there being steps to get into the community center. Having a healthcare center that has a bed that can be lowered so that you don't have to be lifted out of your wheelchair, to be placed on an exam table is probably going to have a different level of importance for somebody who uses a wheelchair than somebody who doesn't. So we wanted to know whether these stakeholder groups agreed that those domains and subdomains outlined by this expert group, were the most important things to measure. And so what we did after these groups is we took a look at these importance weightings. And across the groups, we were able to find that there were some of these broad areas or domains that they considered to be more important to measure than others. Okay, this is just kind of highlighting the work that we're doing. Okay, the ones they thought were most important were really getting the system to measure well person-centered planning and service coordination. And that has to do with not just the fact that we create person-centered plans for people, but whether those plans were actually implemented in a person-centered fashion. So did people receive person-centered services? They wanted us to look at service delivery and effectiveness. You know, if I need a support, do I get that support within a reasonable amount of time? Or 6 months after I request it, am I still being told I'm on a waiting list to get access to these services? Choice and control, a big one. In all the quality of life research that's been done over the last 30 years, having choice and control over one's life is considered to be a very important outcome that is highly valued by people with disabilities. And finally, having my human and legal rights respected. And that involves, not just being free from abuse and getting the care and support you need, but being treated in a respectful manner by the people who provide you with supports. We had a second set of subdomains which people rated to be, for them, of average importance, and then a third set which were viewed as somewhat below average. Okay, that doesn't mean they weren't important, that doesn't mean they weren't viewed as critical, okay, but not as important as those 4 areas kind of at the top of that table. Now, that was really only kind of the first step in our taking a look at the data we have, because we wanted to know whether those stakeholder groups and populations differed and how they prioritize those domains and subdomains. And we found that there was actually a bit more consensus than we thought. Where we found there to be outliers, typically among the stakeholder groups, was that family members tended to view things of being of a different level of importance and different things as being more important or less important than persons with disabilities and the people who provided them with supports. But in essence, we found a much higher level of consensus than we thought we would. So what do? We found some good evidence, we think, of the social validity of the framework, but we also found that there were things that people with disabilities, especially people with disabilities, but also other stakeholders, thought were missing from the framework. Okay, in the US, access to a lot of personal outcomes that people with disabilities want in life are dependent upon whether they have transportation to get to where they need to go to achieve those outcomes. Okay, so people said, you need to include transportation in this framework because it's critical. If I don't have transportation, I can't be included in the community. I can't spend time with the people I want to spend. So I need transportation when and where I need it in a way that's accessible, in a manner that's safe. Employment. Okay, employment within the model that was provided to us kind of as a starting point was kind of embedded 2 or 3 levels deep in this broad subdomain called community inclusion. And what we heard from the people with disabilities that we spoke with is, no, darn it, employment is a critical outcome for me. I want to be employed. I want to be able to contribute to my community. I want to be a taxpayer, okay? And right now, the service system is providing me with disincentives for being employed. Because if I'm employed more than 15 hours a week, I lose so many of my home and community service benefits that it makes absolutely no sense for me to push my employer to provide me with more hours. But you know something? I want more hours. I want to be employed in a way that I'm thinking that I'm making a valuable contribution to society. And then in the United States, one of the critical pieces that we have, problems with our care system, is that staff turnover. The average person who's providing home and community-based services to people with disabilities stays in their position 6 to 9 months. Within a 1-year period of time, if you have 4 people providing you with supports, that entire staff may change over. So how do we expect to provide person-centered supports if we have people providing us with supports who don't know us, who don't know us as an individual, who don't know what our preferences are, our desired life outcomes? So in a nutshell, that was our first study, okay? We learned a lot from it, and we're taking this information and tweaking this framework that the experts developed to, we think, make it better reflect the outcomes that people with disabilities and their family members really think are most important to measure. I'm going to turn things over now to Renata, who's going to talk about the second piece of our research, which is a process in which we have kind of taken a look at what's currently out there as measurement tools, and in a sense, critiqued what they do. Renata?
So in this little transition, I just, we have transitioned from the presentations in the morning that were very focused on the qualitative experience of an individual with a disability. I'm sort of feeling this, people are thinking, so how does this relate to some of this very quantitative measurement, right? And so that's something we really struggle with, because we, as Brian indicated at the beginning, there is a high stake to what we are trying to do because of the large expenditure in the system, and yet we want to honor the individual experiences, and it's not an easy task. Okay, so then this is just kind of to give you the scope. We have research assistants who work with us who have helped us review 130, now it's more than that, now it's about 130 instruments that exist within the US that measure outcomes for people with disabilities. So you can just see, if you are ever thinking of developing something new, please don't start from scratch. Look at the other things that exist, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. With that said, many of these assessment tools are not very good, so there is kind of a balance of not reinventing the wheel and yet critically examining what is out there. Again, our research assistants have coded all of the questions within these instruments, and the purpose is not just some futile exercise to give them work to do. This is really to look at the quality of the questions that are being asked to the individual with a disability or a family member or a provider. So that's the point of all this. So this is to just give you an example. When Brian showed the National Quality Forum with the different domains that might be and are important for people with disabilities, compared to the instruments that exist within the US, how do they overlap with what people see as important? So you can see, for example, that I just point out one of the controversial ones. Under community inclusion, you can see there are many questions that these instruments address under community inclusion. But do you think these questions really address community inclusion? Is it easy to measure community inclusion? Absolutely. So, as I'm seeing the nodding and not nodding of your heads, is that it is not an easy task. So an instrument I work with all the time is the National Core Indicators Survey. Tim knows the instrument, Brian works with it as well. Some of the questions in that instrument that tend to be repetitive are, how many times in the last month have you gone to a coffee shop? How many times in the last month have you gone to the gym? How many times in the last month have you gone to a place of worship? Now, these questions are fine, except that can we really call them community inclusion, right? And so one of our tasks, and some of these areas are not as difficult to conceptualize, is to really, beyond doing a qualitative work, where we can really have a dialogue with a person, what it means to them, is to somehow quantify what it means to be included in a community. And what people have told us in the groups that Brian was describing, it's about engagement, feeling that you are contributing to society, that there is reciprocity of relationships. And so that's something we are trying to tackle within this measurement system. And we are in the second year of the study, and that's really, we are in thick of defining some of these constructs that are so personal to people and yet so diverse across people and different disabilities, and that is extremely challenging. I don't think this is really interesting. So one of the things that we are doing, and I'll go back to this slide because that kind of illustrates. So for every single of these domains and subdomains that were deemed as important in the diagram that Brian showed, we are trying to go into literature, into some theory, to see what really conceptualizes human and legal rights, whatever these are, choice and control, and other aspects of home and community-based services, and then trying to find good questions within the 130 instruments we have coded to match them best to the theory and to what people have been telling us. Now, as you can see, we may have 200 questions under community inclusion, but maybe 8 of them are good questions. And the 8 questions are missing a whole aspect of other types of inclusion that is not covered. So then we are collaborating with Temple University in the US to develop some new questions to cover some of these gaps. So that's the purpose of this particular study that I was describing. So
What did I understand for?
Okay, that in essence tells you that of all the questions that are asked in all these instruments, 130 plus instruments, that focus on evaluating the impact of home and community-based services, that 23% of the questions focus on community inclusion. Doesn't mean they're good questions,
It's
but
just that
23%.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
look at some of those up on the top. Equity. They don't ask questions about equity. Consumer leadership and system development. You know, I mean, our organizations that provide these services, going to people with disabilities and asking them, what do you want these supports to be like? We're not doing it. We're not asking people questions about that. So there
And if we are, the questions are not that good. Yeah, so the quantity versus quality, and I think that's been the discussion for the whole day today, is some of the reconciling the narratives of people that are critical with the number of people that need to be served. So that's something to think about. So this is our list that we'll spend a year and a half, you know, with the 56 or 58 groups all over the country, and then other input of experts on our team and also on our National Advisory Board to pick the subdomains that most matter to people as far as concepts to measure, to go back to the human community-based services and how much is being spent in our country to really serve people with disabilities. And so you can just look at this list, you know, from person choices and goals, transportation, that was one of the new ones that was added to the existing framework, choice of services, meaningful activity, person's needs and goals realized, self-direction, social connectedness and relationships, freedom from abuse and neglect, employment and workforce were added to the framework, person-centered planning, access to resources, and the last one was specifically pointed out to us by another expert, which is fluctuation of capacity, and that relates to people with psychiatric disabilities and also sometimes people with traumatic brain injury, where you have a certain need at a certain point in time and then it changes. And then it changes again. It's not like, you know, sometimes people with intellectual disabilities tend to have more stable features.
Amanda, just a question. When you look at the domains, I understand your wish is in the process of building a scale to represent these domains. Is the wish for this scale to be usable for all disability groups?
That
So
is the
just the-
wish of the people who
Yes.
are driving this,
Right.
which is the Center for Medicaid Services. One of the things that we should say is that we are constantly butting heads with these individuals because they tend to come from medical and rehabilitation backgrounds. What they're used to is designing assessment systems or measurement tools that count things like how many UTIs have you had, or how many pressure ulcers have you had in the last urinary tract infections, how many pressure ulcers have you experienced, how many falls have you had in the last 6 months, and we're constantly arguing them about the fact that, well, okay, those are easy things to count, okay, but you can't count community inclusion. Okay, you need to look at it with much more nuance, with much more understanding that it's going to vary from person to person. One of our most effective self-advocates in the US is a gentleman named Ari Neiman. And Ari is from California, and Ari has an autism spectrum disorder. You know, and he pointed out to us that, you guys realize that under all this stuff on social connected and relationships, there isn't one question that focuses on people getting together via the web, via the internet, and that, he said, for many of the people who I represent as an advocate, That's a much more comfortable way. And telling me that, oh, you've got to be more included in the community, I need to take you out to another coffee shop and a cafe, is not necessarily something which is contributing positively to my life.
Right, so to answer your question, it's an empirical sort of discovery whether we can apply these measures across disabilities, or, there'll be some measures that we probably can, some we cannot, so we'll see.
In the research seminar that I teach, we tried to measure, the students had to measure community inclusion in one way or the other, and we adapted the measure by Salzer.
Mark Salzer? Yeah, that's our partner on the ground.
Mark is one of our
partners. Yeah, so we work very closely.
Things alike. But many have had many difficulties really because of the counting system.
Right.
How do you take all these items and then make them something that makes sense together?
We aren't going to count them.
Right, but we are going to count some things. But we are, so what I want to, there are two things I want to do. Well, I guess it's not here. One is, I just want to tell you in one slide what is sort of the big goal, and then if we have 5 minutes just to ask you about, in relation to this framework, what you think in Israel might come to the top in those domains. So it's related to Shirley's question. We want eventually, this will be in a year or in a year and a half, to collect data on the best questions that we have found in the existing instruments and the questions that are developed in addition to cover some of these main domains, especially those that are really difficult to measure, and to examine them for the basic psychometric properties of assessments, which is reliability, validity, measure discrimination, and sensitivity to change. We have 1,000 people, so it's going to be a big endeavor. Now, one thing is the sensitivity to change is the big question mark. Because what that means is, how can we know what to expect for an outcome to improve, for example? So what does it mean to be better socially included, for your son, versus for somebody else's child with a disability, total different disability? How can we A, compare that outcome, and B, how can we assess if the person is making progress? So that's the most challenging characteristics for us, I think, in this endeavor. The reliability, validity, that's something that we know how to do. So with that, I'm going to put up this back. Do you think in Israel, and I know we don't have much time to ponder this, but do you think some of these would be as important for your society, or would there be some things that are not on this list that are glaring? Anything that you would think you would want to measure with the population of people with disabilities?
In regards, by the way, to specific service, or in general, or in terms of our perceptions towards life or whatever?
Right, so in this particular project, we are measuring the home and community-based service effectiveness, but of course, it can't be totally isolated from what you see as important. Yeah.
I think that we have to take into consideration the cultural background of the person, because it's very hard to answer this question without referring to subgroups within the Israeli society. It depends if I live in the city, if I live in a peripheral area.
That is true.
So it should be sensitive to culture.
To culture, yes. Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yes.
So I think some services, such as never mind. So some services, such as home dialysis, home IV, services that are supposed to let the people continue with their normal life, would be measured by how well they do so. Because if the service is given every day between 8 in the morning and 1, and you have to sit at home and wait for it, it would probably make it harder for you to go to work every day. So sometimes the whole point of the service doesn't work as well as it should be because of not thinking through it.
Right, and that's the domain of service delivery and effectiveness. I think you're referring to that. It interestingly didn't come up to our top 13. But again, you know, it's not saying that it's not important. It's just that where the biggest gaps are for us to measure at this time in the U.S. So I think, you know.
Well, this would probably be a problem for people who want to go out of their house and have a very, very, I don't know, many responsibilities outside of their homes. And that is probably more for some disabilities and not for others.
No, you're right. I mean, I totally agree with that. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Maybe it's not just Israel or US or Canada, but I think that for people with chronic illness, with a disability that is changing according to the condition of the body, this might be a trouble to measure, because you can need something for a month, something for 2 months, then you have remission, then you have so it's changing to
That's
measure
right. And
at
that's
one point.
one of our colleagues put this up for us, the fluctuation of capacity. That was the domain that was added because exactly of the point that you're making. Yeah. Yes, you have a question?
Yeah. Earlier on, you brushed very quickly over validity, and then you said, Brian, that this is not numbers. So how are we looking at validity in this type of research, in your terms?
I think that the first thing was to validate the model itself with people with disabilities and to see across the disability groups, are they saying that, yeah, this makes sense to us?
Oh, that's
okay.
basic.
Yeah, and that's the first step. On the other hand, what we know is even some of the best tools that are out there now being used, and we have one tool called the National Core Indicators that is being used in 40 states. Okay, one version of it has some pretty decent validity and reliability data. Another version, which is used quite often, and many of the tools that are currently used, we don't know whether they are measuring these constructs in a valid, reliable way. When research has been done, it's been done on the entire instrument. So we can say that if we ask these 90 questions, we know that overall, if we ask them today and then we ask them 2 weeks later, the correlation between time 1 and time 2 is 0.83, okay? On the other hand, we don't know whether that's the same correlation we would get if we just asked those questions about community inclusion at time 1 and time 2. So there's a lot of research which is yet to be done to really know whether these instruments are psychometrically sound.
So another, just to add to that, that's why we are collecting data on 1,000 participants, and we do have to, most of these questions are basically on a Likert scale, unfortunately. We do realize the shortcoming of this. So we will be counting things and doing quantitative data analysis. Yeah.
Really interesting work, challenging. Glad it's you and not me. One of the problems with some of the instruments has been the use of sort of proxy data and how do you get a voice of folks with severe intellectual disabilities and stuff. So I wonder how do you kind of address that problem?
So some of the tools in that list of 130 are observational tools. We will be taking, and again, we are just in the middle of all this, we'll be taking some of the approaches of the classic Likert type scales, some observational tools, another tool, the Wisconsin tool, the Peonies, for example. So we'll have slightly different formats to make sure that we do not exclude people with the most severe disabilities, because that's what we fight against all our work out here. So that's a very important point.
That being said, I'm wondering, Tamara, one other thing I think that has to do, I guess, with Israel and the way it works is one thing that isn't in the list, and I think because it does work very differently in the state, has to do with budgets that are given to families and children or whatever it is with disabilities. If we're talking about, let's say, power wheelchair or other things that have to do
with their disabilities that are going to affect many of these things, and I think it does work differently Medicaid-wise. By care, it's the Ministry of Health, it may be something from the Ministry of Education, it may have to do with national health. So there's something there also that I think has to do with Israel policy that's a bit different and may come into one of the top regarding support. I'm saying, like, if we want inclusion, or if we want to be able to go anywhere, or does the family have a car that's accessible and can take the power wheelchair? Do they have the money to pay for it? And if not, who's going to pay for that gap? Or if it's a power wheelchair, if it's other technology the child needs to communicate or otherwise. So that's definitely something.
Right, and for us it's the same, because we have multiple sources of funding for people with disabilities. And so, I mean, luckily, and I don't know how it is here, but in the US, the community of researchers have the power to influence policy, which is a really nice feature about the US that, coming from the Czech Republic, was very foreign to me. And so we do have ways to influence policy, and we work with policymakers directly with our research results, which is a privilege to be able to inform that. So I don't know if you know what you were referring to, but I'm sure that policy-wise between countries there will be some differences.
I have a question about education that was related to another parts, because we talked about employment. I was wondering if education was part of access to resources, if it's sub-domain.
Yes.
Education is included in some of these areas, but this is the framework itself, and the funding agency is basically restricted us to looking at those services and supports that occur outside of the educational system, in the same way that we also can't, because of the limitations that's been put on this work, look at healthcare services. That's considered to be kind of a separate thing in the United States, kind of a separate silo. And oftentimes, even though they are so closely intertwined, okay, it's like, nope, can't ask questions about that, because that's not part of home and community-based service.
Right, but one thing where education does come in, it's not for the person with disability, but for the caregiver. So there were questions we asked about how important is it for caregivers to get training and build their skills if they want.
It also comes in under meaningful community activity. That includes, you know, education, recreation, leisure activity, and a number of different things. And that education is looked at broadly. It could be personal education. I want to, let's say, take part in a yoga class, or an exercise class. I want to go to a community college. To, you know, I want to get my doctorate in disability studies. So that's included there, and one of the arguments that we've had is that that's such an important aspect of community inclusion, whether tool developers, when they see this meaningful activity, are going to give enough attention to developing and validating questions in some of these areas. It's one of the reasons why people with disabilities told us to pull employment out and look at that as a totally separate category, because it was buried within meaningful activity.
We are out of time.
Yes, I think so.
We are also measured by the time we give to break time. And for lunch. So thank you very much for joining us. In terms of break, we have until
1:45. I will be bringing, if you can remove any laptop or expensive equipment, we will be bringing lunch to the table. I think we'll have about 1:45.